let me introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. He doesn't need much of an introduction. He's, of course, Quetelet Professor of Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He is the chair, I believe, of the MDP Alliance, the director of the Sustainable Development Solutions, and in many ways seen as the father of the Millennium Development Goals and efforts to replace them with ambitious and goal-based and ambitious and solutions-focused goals. Jeff, you'll speak to us about the outlook for next year. Floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to New York. Welcome to Columbia University. Welcome to this conference and brainstorming. And as Guido has let us know very clearly, welcome to a remarkable year ahead where we have a chance to really change the direction of the planet. And if we don't do so, we're also going to regret it. So we're at the kickoff of a very important year of diplomacy, actually a little bit more than a year and 2 months, stretching from the climate summit, which opens on the 23rd of September next week, and then the General Assembly on the next day, and through Paris in 2015, in December, the COP21. And I want to spend some time this morning describing why this is such a remarkable opportunity and such a consequential moment for us. And I like to refer to a very wise statement of President Kennedy when he was pursuing something very practical in 1963, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And he faced long odds. This was the height of the Cold War. The distrust between the United States and the Soviet Union had almost ended the world in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The idea of negotiating a treaty of peace between the two superpowers did not seem very likely, and yet it was accomplished thanks to President Kennedy's leadership and Nikita Khrushchev's partnership, and the fact that this was a very good and important idea. And President Kennedy said something in the middle of that battle for a peace treaty that was, I think, very relevant for us. He said, by defining our goal more clearly, and in that case he was talking about the goal of peace, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. And for me, this encapsulates what we're after in the next 15 months. The idea of defining global goals clearly by showing that they are manageable. In other words, not stating merely utopian objectives, but very practical objectives, by showing how they can be achieved. And by doing so, changing the course of the world. How to do that? By helping people around the world to understand what this is about, to take hope that there is a better course, because I think many people in many parts of the world are rightfully afraid and not very optimistic right now. And by being hopeful realistically, to move towards these objectives. So this is a philosophy of leadership, I think, that is extremely important for us, and it really is the backdrop for at least my own thinking about this, and I think a widespread feeling that goal-based sustainable development can be a powerful lever for the world in the same way that goal-based poverty reduction has helped, even though it has not ended extreme poverty. It's helped to accelerate the fight against extreme poverty. We are, therefore, in a transition from a set of goals that have helped but not fully succeeded to a new generation of goals from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's important, therefore, for us to define the goals more clearly and to work towards their manageability, to identify the practical pathways by which these goals can be achieved. And that has to culminate not in a few technical decisions, but in a worldwide shared understanding of a new direction by having people move towards the objectives of sustainable development. It's a big task, and we have very little time to accomplish it. We have wasted a tremendous amount of time. 22 years ago, the Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed. This past year was the fastest increase of greenhouse gases ever. Last month was the warmest month of August in the history of the planet in recorded temperature, I should say, which goes back to the end of the 19th century. We've been forewarned. We've had a treaty in force for 20 years, since 1994, and we haven't changed course. So the time is extremely short. As Guido said, the three pillars of next year's diplomacy are a conference on financing in the middle of next year, money on the table. How will the transformation of energy systems be paid for? How will the poorest of the poor escape from poverty? How will horrendous, shocking epidemics like Ebola and others that will emerge be confronted when they hit the poorest people in the world? That's about financing to a very significant extent. How to mobilize financial resources for new technologies, for transformation, for help for the poor, for other public goods. Second, we'll be adopting sustainable development goals. These have been in negotiation now, as I'll describe, for the last 2 years. There is now a list of 17 potential goals on the table, which should come down to 10 within the next few months, and these should be adopted by September 2015. None of it's going to make too much difference if we continue to fail on climate change, because the planetary disruptions will absolutely get ahead of us. Anybody who counsels that we should merely learn to live with climate change doesn't understand how profound the disruptions already are and how many more and stronger disruptions are on the way. A recent report estimates that about 20 million people were made environmental refugees this past year. It's a plausible estimate. It's a vast number. The consequences of that are even larger because of all of the disruptions that forced migration, displaced populations, famine, and the conflicts that result cause to the whole world, indeed. So the stakes are incredibly high. Why do we have any reason at all to think that these goals could be achieved, especially given the failures to date? Why should we have any optimism? Why shouldn't we be as cynical as many cynics who say, what difference could it make? Another meeting, another conference, another piece of paper? I think that's a huge mistake. First, I don't think we can afford cynicism. It's the ticket to disaster. But more than that, I think it shows a deep misunderstanding of the paradoxical nature of our time. Maybe I'll go back again to President Kennedy, who said in 1961, we hold in our mortal hands the ability to end all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life. Our times are paradoxical. Because of the technological capacities, the things that we seek to do are absolutely within reach. Ending poverty, moving to sustainable agriculture, moving to low-carbon energy systems. They're not easy, but they're within reach. On the other hand, our capacity to destroy ourselves is obviously also within reach. We seem to try to practice that every day. So I find this picture probably the single most compelling reason for optimism. It's Moore's law, depicted as the number of transistors on integrated circuits, shown here from 1971 till today. We live in the midst of an unbelievable technological revolution that we've only just begun to harness. And that is the fact that because of Moore's law, the capacity to store, manipulate, and transmit data have increased by a factor of about 5 billion since the end of the 1950s. In 1961, Jack Kilby put 2 transistors on a chip. And last year, Intel put 5 billion transistors on a chip. And that's, of course, why we have been able to see this unbelievable revolution. We've already reached what many would say is the absolute culmination of civilization, the fact that you can stream a movie on your phone. But we could probably even do more than that. We could probably address illiteracy, disease control, climate change, and countless other problems through the capacity of information and networking. I personally would like to see 100,000 young people face-to-face on a Google Hangout regularly. Not to diminish face-to-face, but I like the fact that we use this information revolution. We save the airplane exhausts and the greenhouse gases, and we learn to really cooperate and communicate intensively on a regular basis on problem solving in our new information age. That seems to me to be absolutely thrilling. We're already doing diagnostics for rural African health conditions by telemedicine in different parts of the world. You can read a slide, look at a lesion, do a diagnosis from anywhere. We have real-time information systems of the minute-to-minute use of electricity in villages in Mali because information technology allows this. This, to me, is the great hope, that we can use this unbelievable outpouring of knowledge effectively. I recommend, by the way, get online through your library, university library subscriptions, and read the weekly issues of Nature and Science. At least for me, it's the front half of the issue, the part that's intelligible, because that's the part that gives the summary of the advances of scientific insight during the week. There's more in 1 week in either of those issues than one could have imagined for decades in the past. The enterprise of knowledge creation is absolutely unbelievable. Somehow it has remained incredibly robust all the way through all of our turmoil. And indeed, it continues to accelerate. We just don't harness it effectively. The internet now is more in the service of personal advertising than it is in problem solving. So we have the market grab these technologies rather than solve problems. Markets will not solve our problems. Markets can amplify solutions, but they will never direct us towards the solutions. So that's why we need goals to tell us where we're going. We don't have those goals right now. So we have Moore's Law, and we have more surveillance, more spying, more online advertising, but we don't have solutions to the problems that we need. And we need to harness these technologies and these tools for real solutions. So it's not as if there aren't some good things happening in the world. Of course, there are wonderful areas of progress, and the most important is the reduction of poverty itself. The Millennium Development Goal to cut extreme poverty by half, comparing the 1990 baseline and 2015, was achieved already in 2010. If you take the developing world as a whole, that's thanks to China mostly, but it is a human-wide achievement. It was empowered by the information age, without question. Without the semiconductor, there was no way for 1.3 billion people in China to escape from poverty. Interestingly, that reduction of poverty is happening all over the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, in most places that are lucky enough to be kept out of conflict. It's the conflict zones that are so devastating for us. It's why war really is the stupidest approach to all of the problems we have, just as the United States seems to specialize in it, unfortunately. And it's really a tragic waste of time and resources. This occurred under a will to fight poverty. I was surprised to learn recently from a senior minister in China that the Millennium Development Goals actually played a role in China as well. I hadn't really felt that. I've been advisor on the MDGs since 2001 to the Secretary General of the UN, and I always felt that China's dynamism was China's making, and the MDGs were very helpful in other parts of the world, but not in China. But this minister assured me that within the cabinet in China, the fact of the MDGs actually spurred some very important reforms. He was in particular talking about China's recent move over the last 10 years to universal health coverage. And he said the MDGs were one of the very important impetuses in the cabinet discussions of their health policies. So this is evidence that we could really move fast, and it's why the world has taken hope, including the governing board of the World Bank last year, to actually announce a timeline to the end of poverty. The World Bank formally has adopted 2030 as the date for the effective end of poverty according to the World Bank's definition, which is the $1.25 per person per day definition. We prefer in the MDG era, and I think the SDG era, a more holistic vision of what poverty means. Poverty means the ability to escape from deprivation on many fronts, not only income, but also disease, lack of access to safe water and sanitation, illiteracy, and so forth. So we take a multidimensional view of poverty, and there too there is tremendous progress, though not yet fast enough. It's possible that extrapolating and accelerating, I should say, the progress in the fight against poverty could really lead us to a world with no multidimensional poverty in this sense, extreme poverty, within a couple of decades. And we're going to have a panel on Malaysia shortly. Malaysia is a country that did that. It got down to zero in extreme poverty. This is a tremendous achievement and an illustration of what's possible more generally. These are the kinds of scorecards one sees about the MDGs. Generally, you have a mix of goals achieved in different regions, which are the olive green, and goals that are not yet on track adequately, which is the light green, and then the bright red indicators where things are really off track. And you can see that on the whole, there is mixed progress. Some success, some not fast enough, and a few pockets of backsliding which need to be addressed. But the reason why we're moving from the MDGs to the SDGs is that the world has recognized that the problems definitely in our time go beyond the most urgent challenge, which is fighting extreme poverty, to the broader instability of our societies and the profoundly destabilizing relationship between humanity and the physical environment. We live in a world of growing inequality, growing instability, and high youth unemployment in many parts of the world. I have been traveling extensively in recent years as part of the MDGs and now part of the SDG negotiations and the SDSN network. And I started to feel quite bad because every place I landed there was a riot. And I don't know yet whether to take it personally or not. But we've seen a tremendous amount of unrest, and it's growing. And I would not discount continued eruptions like this in the United States. We had our brief moment of the Occupy Wall Street. Other places have it more frequently. All over the world, not in every country, but in most, youth unemployment is very high. There's a generational divide. There is a growing inequality of wealth and income in most places in the world, I would say. And this is leading to the realization, not by everybody by any means, but by many, that social inclusion needs to be put much higher in our goals, that we have to define the idea of social inclusion and equality in a much more operational way. And so this becomes a second pillar of the SDGs. If the first pillar is economic and ending poverty, the second pillar is social, creating societies that are more equal, that have more social mobility, that have more gender equality, that are perceived to be fair and effective. And this is a huge challenge around the world. The third pillar of the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, is to restore a balance between humanity and the physical environment. And I think most people here in this hall are working on that challenge in one way or another. We know that we are in a devastating situation. This is mainly a matter of scale. The world population has increased roughly tenfold since the start of the Industrial Revolution. The output per person, on average, has increased roughly 30-fold. We have perhaps a 200 to 300 time increase of the weight of human activity on the physical planet, and the size of the physical planet has increased precisely zero during this period. So we have a scale challenge, which is that the world economy has become huge. It's $90 trillion roughly, measured at purchasing power parity. The use of resources is rising and unprecedentedly large, and ecosystems in every part of the world are under unique strain, unique in terms of human history. And we had one big difference with all earlier generations of humanity, and that is that when the environment got tough in a particular location, people migrated. Now we have filled the planet. When people try to migrate, they end up often shot at the border or end up sunk in the Mediterranean, as just happened a couple of days ago with a fleet of desperate Africans fleeing poverty in Africa, and they were rammed by smugglers who deliberately sank their vessel, and hundreds died. It made one tiny line on page 18 of the newspaper, because the deaths of poor people don't register in general. But the environmental consequences of this filled planet are therefore startling, because there's no place to run. There's no place to hide. And what we understand now better and better is that the human impacts are multidimensional and highly complex, and moving with greater intensity very rapidly. We are huge fans of the framework of planetary boundaries. I say we at the SDSN and at the Earth Institute, huge fans of the framework of planetary boundaries that Professor Johan Rockström and colleagues introduced in 2009, in which leading ecologists aim to define quantitatively various threshold levels of key ecosystem functions and dynamics to say we are close to or beyond these thresholds. And at high noon on this famous graph is climate change, because that really is the biggest disruptor of all. We have already, or are just about to move out of the range of the Holocene climate. That is the climate of the last 10,000 years, which has been the climate that humanity has known during the entire period of civilization. We are now at the border of that Holocene temperature because the mean temperature has increased by 0.9 of 1 degree Celsius. And when it reaches 1 degree Celsius, we're basically outside the band of fluctuations of the Holocene. We have reached a level of carbon emissions which we've not seen for millions of years on the planet. So we are breaking boundaries, and the other concept that's closely related and, of course, of also potent validity is the Anthropocene, that we have changed the climate so much already and other features of the Earth's systems that we've actually entered a new geologic epoch. And this is the idea that Paul Crutzen and his colleagues have rightly championed. If you go around the circle, it's startling the number of environmental challenges. I don't really need to remind this group, but I will. Ocean acidification, stratospheric ozone depletion, which we hope is under control, but not absolutely sure. Nitrogen and phosphorus cycling, because we need responsible use of the fertilizers that we absolutely need to grow the food on the planet. Global fresh water use, which is being depleted massively by tens of thousands of large dams on every major river, many rivers not running to the ocean anymore, massive groundwater depletion, and of course changing evapotranspiration patterns under warming, which seem to suggest, for good physical reasons, a massive extension of soil moisture drying in many parts of the world, especially the dryland regions. Massive destruction of land use and therefore loss of biodiversity. Massive aerosol loadings in the atmosphere, which make the air in China and Indian cities almost unbreathable. And massive chemical pollutants, not yet quantified because there's so many of them and the potential costs are so high. So these are the planetary boundaries that ostensibly sustainable development needs to respect, to recognize, to define clearly, and then define pathways to honor. The most important of these is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we are on a trajectory shown in this famous chart of the IPCC by the top curve, which is the reference concentration pathway 8.5, a 4 to 6 degrees Celsius increase. The world has promised to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius or lower. That requires a trajectory like the bottom trajectory of RCP3. To get to this is an incredibly difficult challenge. This is the business as usual path. This is the path that the world needs. That's the gap that we need to define and then show to be manageable and have the world move towards. Of course, all over the world we're seeing the consequences of the environmental failures. And just in the last 6 months, as I've traveled, Sumatra, the Balkans, massive flooding, unprecedented over a scale of centuries. California and its worst drought by far in modern history. This is one of the water reservoirs of California shown in May. The drought has not eased. This is another water reservoir in Sao Paulo state, another huge drought underway. These are just places I happen to visit and collect pictures along the way, and it's absolutely startling how many massive disruptions there are taking place around the world. This is our own Goddard Institute of Space Studies temperature map for August 2014. It is the warmest August, as I said, in history since temperature records began in 1881. So, what to do? What to do starts with defining goals, that we need a change of direction. We need to mobilize global conscience and consciousness about these challenges, and we need to change policies and technologies. And for that, we need the public to understand the challenge, to see that it is manageable, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. The most compelling step of this will be the Sustainable Development Goals, assuming that they are finalized in negotiations. They were adopted as a tool for world change in June 2012 at the 20th anniversary of the Earth Summit. The conferees in adopting the idea of Sustainable Development Goals were looking to the Millennium Development Goals for inspiration. And they said goal-based development is important. We've had treaties now in place, 3 big ones signed at the Earth Summit on climate, biodiversity, and desertification. None of them is operational. We need to raise the awareness and the rate of change of policies and technologies dramatically. And so they called for SDGs, and they said that these should be adopted in time to hand the baton from the MDGs to the SDGs on a schedule for September 2015. I'm impressed at how hard the General Assembly has been working and debating these issues actually in the last 2 years. We in the SDSN have been very actively participating in this. I've had the good fortune to speak in the General Assembly countless times over the last 2 years. And there is a tremendous amount of interest, because when I challenge the ambassadors, I say every one of your countries is in trouble. No one contradicts. They know it. This is a worldwide phenomenon. If we can just take our attention away from the short-term crises and distractions and pay enough attention, we're actually going to get to Sustainable Development Goals, to integrate the economic, social, and environmental objectives. The SDSN last year made a set of recommendations about what these goals should be, 10 in number, shown here. Ending extreme poverty, I think there's universal consensus. This is SDG number 1. Promoting sustainable growth and jobs, because employment is a fundamental objective. Education for all, at least through secondary level, with quality, not just attendance. Social inclusion, gender equality, and human rights. Universal health coverage. Sustainable agriculture, both in the sense that agriculture is productive enough to feed the planet, is resilient enough to absorb climate change, and is sustainable enough in technology to stop disrupting the planet, because agriculture is both the biggest victim of environmental change and the biggest single cause as well. It's the biggest single driver of land use change and of greenhouse gas emissions of any sector. And yet it's also the sector that is by far the most vulnerable to environmental destruction. We need to feed ourselves, and it's a large populous planet. Sustainable cities, because we are in an era where, and in an age, I should say, where now 53% of humanity lives in urban areas, and that will go up to 70% or so by 2030. Sustainable energy and controlling climate change. Sustainable management of our ecosystems, land, species, biodiversity, oceans, and the broad category of good governance, where we include governance not only of political institutions, but also of businesses. because good business governance is as essential as good political governance to the success of sustainable development. How do you do this? This seems completely beyond anything other than utopian. Such a large reorientation for the world, yet it's vital, and it's extraordinarily urgent because the time is running out on many fronts, just given how big the world population is and how much it is already destabilizing nature. And I would say the social dislocations are also huge and increasingly dangerous. So the urgency is very great. We believe that part of the process of success is goal setting, studying the pathways to success, or what is sometimes called backcasting, identifying technology solutions which are key, because I would insist that without technological systems-based approaches, we're not going to be able to make the changes of agriculture, of energy, of city organization needed for 8 billion or not even 9 billion people on the planet. Demonstration projects to prototype successes, massive scale-up, and accelerated global mass learning, and using the world of information to get the attention of people. All of this, I would say, could be defined as directed growth, directed investment-led growth. Directed meaning that directed by goals, rather than the idea of the first page of an economics textbook that a market system is self-organizing, an invisible hand. No. We need a quite visible guide back to safety. And so that's what the goals can do. Who leads this effort? Nobody. Who will lead this effort? Nobody. Because it has to be a collective effort. I compare it to what are called conductorless orchestras, which can play absolutely wonderful music without a conductor. There is no conductor in the world. But we could all play from the same sheet music and have the chance to, therefore, move in the right direction. I don't see politically any other way but shared agreements, shared goals, treaty obligations, and a lot of decentralized approaches. So top-down or bottom-up, both. Planned, not quite. Looking ahead, absolutely yes. And based on shared scientific and technological perspectives. We have recently, this is Guido's construction of labyrinth of how a public-private partnership can start with the goals, right up at the top, shared goals and metrics, then backcasting, and then going down delivery systems, financing technology transfer, and outcomes with lots of side arrows, projecting research and development, advocacy, monitoring and evaluation, and lots of feedbacks. It is a feedback system driven by goals, monitoring outcomes, and feeding back to adjust concepts, develop technologies, and speed the transformation. I believe we need a deep technological transformation. This is not only about being nice to each other, though that would help, and it's not a return to a simpler life, because that would be the case if we had 500 million people on the planet. But with 7.2 billion people, about to be 8 billion, we better have systems that can help provide food, energy, transport, water, and that is not low technology. That is sophisticated, and it's got to be based on the information revolution. Basically, and I will just conclude here, all of the economic progress of the last 2 centuries has been driven by basic technology waves, sometimes called Kondratiev waves, after the great economic historian, the Russian economist Nikolai Kondratiev, who wrote about these in the 20s and 30s before being killed by Stalin. And he identified these fundamental waves from steam to rail to electrification, the internal combustion engine, to computing. Of course, he didn't, but now we live in the age of computing. And the real question, in my view, is what's sometimes called in this literature the sixth wave of a sustainable technology wave that leads the next round of global development, and heavily based on what information technology can mean, not only on what we can communicate or compute through our personal computers or cell phones, but how information changes nanotechnology, material science, genomics, agronomics, and many other areas. So we have tools of incredible power. And when the goals are set, it's startling what can be achieved. You know, the first human genome sequence cost several $billions. And that was a great project led by government of the United States, the National Institutes of Health. After the first genome was sequenced, the experts got together again under NIH auspices and said, what's next? And they said, well, why don't we try to improve the speed and processing so that each genome would cost not billions of dollars or the 100 million in 2001, but $1,000, so that it could be used diagnostically, it could be used scientifically, it could be used to understand ecosystems, and so on. And they set the goal. That straight line drawn in this semi-log graph is Moore's law rate of decline of costs. The actual decline of costs achieved is the green dots. What's shown is that within 13 years, the NIH successfully drove the cost of sequencing down from $100 million to $1,000 this year. That's a factor of 100,000 improvement. Targeted is the kind of improvement we need to achieve on many fronts. Of course, we've had 100-fold improvement on photovoltaic cells, and there's a lot more on the way. There's some wonderful ideas, some great labs in Switzerland and elsewhere that have tremendous advances of PV circuitry on the way, or not only circuitry, but basically semiconductor design and organic semiconductors. So photovoltaics will be within universal reach in every clinic, school, and homestead in rural areas anywhere far from the grid, which would tremendously improve lives and access to information and access to safety. I live in a country that thinks that technology is mainly driven by famous rich entrepreneurs. They have done some things, but the fact of the matter is that most of the basic scientific advances were actually driven by government, at least to get the basic scientific breakthroughs. I have to tell you, unfortunately, a lot by war, because governments invest in war technologies, and then those spin off to change lives during peacetime. But if you think about what has actually our age, radar, of course, cryptography that we need for all our online payment systems and so on, the nuclear age, computing, semiconductors, space science, the internet, genomics, countless medicines, recently the identification of the Higgs boson as a basic science. These are all government driven. We need the role of the state, not for war, but for sustainable development. And we need to understand the basic dynamics of how these fundamental advances have been achieved. The SDSN is urging a series of public-private partnerships on technology breakthroughs that will be needed for sustainable development, whether it's renewable energy sources that are more effective, carbon capture and sequestration, safe nuclear energy, advances in agronomy, and so forth. We need to focus on the kinds of research and development breakthroughs that will be vital, and to set up these kinds of public-private partnerships that have played such an important role in these areas of science and technology in our recent history, but this time around sustainable development goals. Again, the most important of these is probably deep decarbonization, moving the energy system within 3 decades to a low-carbon energy system. It's almost unimaginably hard to accomplish this, not mainly because of the technology, but because of how deeply inbuilt the fossil fuel energy system is in the world economy. And by the way, you have to love fossil fuels if they weren't wrecking the planet, because they made the modern world. Without coal, oil, and gas, there was no breakthrough from extreme poverty, which was 90+% of the world. So fossil fuels are with us for a reason. They led to the profound advance of economic well-being and the reduction of poverty from 95% of the world to 15% of the world for the last 2 centuries. They have this darn side effect, however, that we can't continue to use them. So you have a system that is profoundly, deeply entrenched that also needs to change at great speed. And when systems are entrenched, they're entrenched not only in infrastructure, in know-how, in engineering practice, they're also entrenched in politics, because there is no stronger lobby in the whole world than big oil. And we're right up against big oil so far. And big oil is winning. And that's a big problem, because we need to change direction. So we have led a project at SDSN in the past year of 15 teams from around the world looking at how the high-emitting countries could deeply decarbonize. One of the things we want all of you to do everywhere is to work on deep decarbonization pathways for your respective regions or countries. And we're going to be putting up a template soon of how one can do this kind of analysis and show what are pathways to deep decarbonization in different countries in the world. One of the best examples of such a demonstration is Denmark, actually, which did a wonderful study in 2009 and showed Denmark could completely get out of fossil fuel by mid-century. And it's doing that. It's already one of the lowest carbon economies, and it's taking seriously the pathway that it generated. And it's got some fantastic companies like Vestas and others which enable it to move forward. So just to conclude, we need to create an institutional breakthrough on many fronts to achieve these goals. And in COP21 as one example, what we're advocating is somehow making a breakthrough to far more ambition by putting a 3-tiered structure in place. The first tier would be the basic, modest commitments that are on the table right now to 2030. Second, calling on all countries to put bold, deep decarbonization pathways, not legally binding, but demonstrated on the table to 2050, and then organizing these public-private partnerships for low-carbon technology to enable us to get there. One of the things I learned in the Millennium Development Goal period is every time you had a new idea, somebody would say, well, no new institutions. This is a huge mistake. We need new institutions. The big problem with the public sector and the international sector is old institutions never end. So unlike nature, you just get continuing proliferation. But the truth is we need to direct resources towards new institutions. The standing institutions were created to solve certain problems. We need new institutions to solve the new problems. Is it possible? It is possible. It is within reach. And I'm going to end one third time with President Kennedy, because there was one other aspect of his administration that, for me, came to the core of my own growing up. And that, of course, was the moon shot. I was 7, not quite 7, when he announced it. When he stood in Congress in early 1961 as a new president, and he said, I urge America to take on the challenge of putting a man on the moon and bringing him back safely to Earth by the end of this decade. And it was an astounding call for this challenge, in part because the agency charged with doing it, NASA, had no plan of how to do this when President Kennedy said this. It would take them 18 months to make the plan afterwards. They actually had 3 different mock-ups. Should there be an Earth orbital that then goes to the moon? Should there be a moon orbital that then lands on the moon? Or should there be a direct shot to the moon and back? And so they had 3 mock-ups of how this could conceivably be done, but they were like cartoons. It took them 18 months of engineering. Then they did it. They did it in 8 years. By the way, in 8 years, we couldn't even achieve building 1 power plant with carbon capture and sequestration, though we tried. That's how different our time is right now. We don't know how to do great things. We know how, but we have somehow forgotten how to do great things. But President Kennedy called on this, and the nation rallied. And by the way, NASA bought more semiconductor chips than any purchaser in the world. And that's what gave us our information age in so many different ways, by spurring technology, computing, photovoltaics, semiconductors, microelectronics, and a lot more. So President Kennedy was asked, why are we doing this? Why should we do this? Could we really do this? And he gave a famous speech at Rice University in 1962, and I just want to close with that. He said, we choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win, and the others too. So let's win sustainable development. Thank you very much.